Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 38 of Days Gone By on Gran Turismo 6 in particular. And this particular episode is featuring one of the relatively few, what you could say, are vintage cars on Gran Turismo. Now of course the definition of vintage cars and classic cars tends to be viewed in a certain way. For instance, vintage cars are often viewed as being before 1950, with some exceptions, and classics tend to be before 1990. That's the way that most people tend to think of it. But in reality, that's actually not the case. It's easy to stick to that way of thinking, but it's just not true anymore, because as we progress through modern years, the definition of a classic has to change. Now, I'm not saying that cars from the year 2000 can be considered a classic now, because that doesn't really feel correct, but I think that vintage cars could justifiably be brought up into the 1950s as well. Maybe not the late 50s, but some of the early 50s vehicles, especially vehicles that were perhaps developed earlier on or are, say, a result of older technology, say military technology for instance. Now this particular car is from 1954. It's one of the slowest cars on Gran Turismo, and on GT6, to be honest, its usability isn't that great, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. This isn't a car that I'm going to turn around and say, whatever you're expecting is wrong, this is actually some monstrously quick, complete sleeper that nobody knew was as quick as it is. It actually can do 220 miles an hour and outhandle a Red Bull. No, of course not. It's a Citroen 2CV from 1954. What you get is what you get. So the question is, what do you get? Because you don't see many people using this car, not necessarily surprisingly, and many people, especially younger people, that's a bit biased, I know, but generally speaking, younger people don't tend to have as much interest in older cars. There are some exceptions, and I can appreciate that. That was me growing up as well. But for many people, they've probably never driven this car. Maybe they haven't even given it a second thought in the dealership. If so, what potential does it have? Because that's the point of all of my review videos. Many people, actually, on a slight side note, have issues with the fact that I fully tune cars in reviews. The reason why I do that is very simple. These reviews are not to tell you about the cars. It's not difficult to know about cars, you can just buy one and find out. What these reviews are for is for value. This is for people who don't want to waste money, which is why I fully tune every single car in every single review, because it tells people what that car's potential is. So then they can make a truly informed decision about whether or not that car is worth it to them, given its potential. So what's the potential of this car? Well, for 21 grand, which straight off the bat is pretty cheap for a car of its age, you get some, well, reasonably underwhelming specs, even in fully tuned form. The 445cc naturally aspirated engine powering the front wheels only is putting out a monstrous 60 horsepower. And, more impressively, 70 foot-pounds of torque. Not bad, but not exactly amazing. Now, it weighs in only 445 kilos, which is very good, because you certainly wouldn't want to be transporting around more weight than that. Now that is of course with a weight loss package, but even without it, it's not a heavy vehicle. The horsepower per tonne is pretty tiny, at 135, but what would you expect? And the PP, even when fully tuned, is one of the lowest that we've ever featured. 373 PP is ultra low. In fact, I don't know of many people who race cars that often below 400 pp. And that brings us to the primary problem of this car. The problem isn't that this car is slow, because some of my favourite cars of Gran Turismo's past are actually pretty slow. The Ford Model T from Gran Turismo 4, for instance, is even slower than this, but it was still an awesome car to own, purely for the novelty of it and the historical significance, being, of course, the first mass production car. Then, even slower than that, and Gran Turismo 4 players will probably remember this fondly, you have the two ancient 1886 godfathers of the automobile from Mercedes-Daimler. They were the slowest cars in the game. I believe they could do something like 1 to 2 miles per hour, or something like that. you could do a lap of the Nürburgring in about 146 hours. So not exactly quick, but really cool to own, if for no other reason than the novelty of it. This car is one of the relatively few ultra-slow cars to actually make it into the newest Gran Turismo game. There are others that have been left behind as well, like the three-wheeled version of the Daihatsu Midget, which was also a pretty cool little car which we don't have anymore. But, as I was saying, the problem with this car isn't that it's slow. Being slow isn't an issue. As it happens, this car can do around 100 miles per hour without NOS. That's not bad at all for its power. But the problem is it's just not useful. Now, of course, this is primarily a collector's piece, but for many people that's not enough. For many people on Gran Turismo, you want to race. And that's understandable. It's a racing game, so of course you want to race your cars. You don't necessarily want stuff just for cruising, depending on your interests, or just cars that basically sit in your garage doing nothing. This has a danger of being like that for many people, myself included. When you have as many cars as I have to review them all, some just don't get used, and this is one of those. That doesn't mean, however, that I don't like the car. It's just a position of predicament where, yeah, it's cool, it's quirky, it's fun to take out and drive once in a while, but it doesn't really have much use beyond that. Now, some vehicles are just for fun. You take them out purely for the fun of driving them. When they're slow, though, that does tend to put some people off. You will often choose a car that has to keep up with the competition, for instance, in a cruise lobby, and unless people actually stick to a low speed limit, which people usually don't, then this car just can't keep up. So as fun as it is to own and to drive, and it is pretty fun to drive in a quirky old school kind of way, its range of use is just so limited that most people just won't get a huge amount of use out of it. So I'm definitely not recommending that you shouldn't buy it. I mean, it's only 21 grand, but I'm just saying that this is a car which is very much for the right kind of person. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.